As a Gainesville, Florida custom home builder, I'm going to break down my average cost per square foot to build in 2025. Construction costs can vary widely, and my current homes under construction are between $200 a square foot and $350 a square foot. I'm going to break down the differences and things that can impact cost. So the first factor in determining cost is the shape of the house. And so what I mean by that is how many corners does the house have? So if you could imagine a square house, just four corners, it'd be a very simple house to build. Very easy to pour the slab, very easy to frame, very easy, to do the roof on the house. And for each additional corner that you add, it adds complexity. It's a harder foundational layout, harder house to frame. The roof gets cut up. There's a lot of valleys and hips, and so forth in the roof. So, that's a big thing to look for is how many corners are in the house. Now, most of my custom homes are going to have 20 to 30 corners. And if you go, if you look on plan websites, you look at nice homes and nicer subdivisions, you're going to see a lot of corners on houses. But the less corners you put on a house, typically the easier it is to frame and the cheaper it will be to build. So another important factor is roof pitch. So the steeper the roof, the more material is going to be required, the harder it's going to be to work on. All around, the steeper the roof, the more expensive it'll get. That'll come from, the truss package, framing materials, framer, roofer, roofing materials, all of that will increase. Now, if you do a really low pitched roof, it gets easier to work on. Less material is going to be needed. So it works out really well on more modern style or Mediterranean style homes or South Florida style homes. Low roof pitch is more natural. Now, a lot of the country style homes, we get into the, 9/12s, 10/12s, 12/12 pitches, and for some homes, somewhere in the middle works, but it really depends on the style of home, and the steeper the pitch, the more expensive it'll make the house. And so another big cost consideration are the height of the walls. So back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 8-foot wall heights were typical. Well, now in 2025, most Gainesville custom homes are going to have a standard of 10-foot wall heights. And really even taller. Sometimes we have two-story homes. We have open to below areas and balcony areas where, we have 20-foot walls. So the higher the walls, obviously, the more expensive framing material is going to be, more sheetrock costs, insulation costs, all of that, painting costs. So keep in mind, the taller the wall, the more the cost will increase. And then also on most of my custom homes, we're going to have vaulted ceilings and tray ceilings. So that's one thing to consider. It's not a huge cost increase, but, naturally by, adding those taller ceilings with the vaulted ceilings or the trays, you're adding volume. So you're, adding more material. And then also, for labor, we're having to work off of, scaffolding or taller ladders. So that's, a minor consideration as well when figuring out costs. The next thing that influences pricing is specs and materials used. So, are the exterior walls going to be, wood frame 2x6, or are they going to be CMU concrete block, for example? Or is the foundation going to be a monolithic slab or a stem wall foundation? Or, is the roof going to be shingles or metal? All these structural differences will have an associated price that comes with it. And then, of course, there's a lot of interior finishes and specs, that make a lot of sense. So like flooring, for example, or cabinets or countertops, or how many, paint colors are we using? Some of these things are easy to figure out. So like flooring, for example, you can use a $4 square foot flooring, or you can use a $6 square foot flooring. That's pretty easy to figure out with simple math. Some things are going to be more complicated, like cabinets, or, if you add a stone fireplace or not. Some of those things you're going to have to get with your builder to figure out pricing for. So like with me, whenever I give an initial estimate to my clients, I'll give, let's say they're considering white windows or black windows, or a stone fireplace or no fireplace. I'll give, different options to, add or subtract to the estimates. That way my clients can see these things they're on the fence about or considering and what the associated costs are. And then there's certain costs that really depend on the lot you're building on. So for example, there could be a soil issue on your property, which is really common in Southwest Gainesville and the Jonesville area. So if there's a soil issue, like let's say there's expansive clays that need to be removed. So we do soil remediation. That can add $10,000 to $30,000, where if you were building, let's say in High Springs where there wasn't a soil issue, that would be a cost that would not need to be factored in. Another thing is if you're building on a 1/4 acre lot versus a 20 acre parcel. You know, on a 20-acre parcel, you're probably going to be 500 feet, 1,000 feet off the road, maybe 2,000 feet off the road. Where on a quarter-acre lot, you're probably 50 feet off the road. So, you know, and the difference in those two lots, you know, getting electric to the house, you know, the length of your driveway is another really big thing. If you're on a big piece of property, you may need a really long driveway that you would not need if you're on a smaller property. So these are, you know, kind of lot-specific costs that will vary depending on where you're going to build. So in general, there's a lot of costs that impact the final cost per square foot to build, you know, and while my, you know, average costs are between $200 to $350 a square foot, you know, there are builders in the area that are, you know, able to build for less than that. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of builds in the area that will be more than $350 a square foot, depending on how complex the build is, you know, and how high end the finishes are. You know, really the sky's the limit on the other end of the spectrum. If you found this video helpful, you know, like, subscribe, and then comment below if there's any questions that you want answered that I didn't go over.